to talk with me about a study on this very question of the future of sovereign debt, a study done by the Bank of International Settlements. I'm joined by Chris Leithner from the investment group Leithner and Associates. Chris Leithner, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Just before we go to the Bank of International Settlements, the report there by Sachin Das and Stephen Long, if there's a run on Greek banks, as there appears to be a trust issue now at the very least in the last couple of days, countries like Great Britain are in heavy debt already to Greece. Does this have knock-on effects to their debtor, to the countries that have lent the money?
The short answer is yes. And when we talk about a bank run, we're basically saying that depositors want their money back. The trouble, though, not just with Greek banks, but with any bank, full stop, any bank, including Australian banks, is that depositors' money does not sit in the vault, where people might think that it does. Why? Because banks lend deposits. So that when people want their money back, they can't have it back, quite literally. And it's been enshrined in law for the past 150 years. This is a legalized fraud. They're basically saying to depositors, this is a deposit. You can reclaim it instantly, anytime you like. But please don't do it too much or too often. Why? Because the money in actual fact is not there, and we can't repay you. So
because they're using it for other purposes.
That's exactly right. Yes. So that this.
But they do have to have a minimum cash holding, don't they, of 30% or something? I think it was.
In Australia, technically and legally, there is no minimum deposit requirement. In other countries, there is. And getting back, we'll get to the BIS report through a process called a BAL, as in the town in Switzerland. There are some recommended minimum requirements for banks, but they're not enshrined in legislation. Okay. But the critical point with any bank, and it's just not a Greek bank, is that when the horses take flight, that's to say depositors become nervous, it can happen. It happened to the biggest savings and loan in the United States not 18 months ago. It very nearly happened to Citigroup, so that when people take fright, then a seemingly impregnable fortress, a very strong bank, can be felled very, very quickly.
Well, to matters at hand, and the reason why I've asked you onto the program tonight is to explain and go through a little of this study done by the chief economist at the Bank of International Settlements. First of all, who or what is the Bank of International Settlements? You don't actually hear of it that often, but it's quite a pivotal finance institution.
The Bank of International Settlements was established as part of the Treaty of Versailles, which helped to settle the First World War. The purpose was basically to manage the gargantuan reparations to be paid by Germany and more generally by Eastern European countries. Its initial job was to manage those sorts of international transfers. That went bad in the 1920s. Since then, they've become, and I'm simplifying here, sort of an advisory body, not a central bank to central banks, but a sounding board to the world's central banks.
Indeed, most of the world's global capital goes through there at one point. It's like a central clearinghouse, isn't it?
Not quite, no. It plays much more an advisory role.
Oh, really?
So that the Bank of England, the Fed, are completely sovereign. They're not going to answer to anybody, including the U.S. Congress, by the way, or to the Parliament in London, so that the Bank of International Settlements plays important roles, but they're not officially sanctioned. They're not carved in stone. They're much more advisory, technical, behind-the-scenes sorts of things.
All right. Now, it's interesting to know, before we look at this study, that they were one of the few large institutions that warned of the coming global financial crisis, and they were largely, if not completely, ignored.
That's exactly right. William White was their chief economist at the time, a Canadian, who said to the Federal Reserve, under both Greenspan and Bernanke, to the Bank of England, to the world's central banks, he made 2 points. One is that there are big, big troubles out there. That's point one. Point two, the world's central banks, are causing those problems. And I'm drastically compressing or simplifying
yes.
that you are artificially depressing interest rates below a level which would occur in a free market. You are encouraging people to borrow far too much by pushing those rates to a very artificially low level. You are inflating the prices of assets. So to give one example, people in Australia see the price of houses allegedly always rises. Credit is artificially cheaply available. The entire mentality of the country evolves over time such that, as our grandparents would have done, you don't save for 30 years and buy a house towards the end of your life. Rather, at the beginning of your life, you borrow, you get a mammoth mortgage, and then you repay it over the years. Why?
Until you're nearly dead.
That's exactly right. And the mentality in Australia today is much like it was in California or Arizona a few years ago. That's to say, the price of real estate never falls, so don't you worry, borrow as much as you possibly can. Why? Because inflation will take care of the debt.
Although Glenn Stevens, the Reserve Bank Governor of Australia, did warn about this attitude in the last week or so.
That's typical boilerplate. Why anyone would take that particularly serious. If he was dead set serious about that, he would halt the growth of credit in its tracks. But he's not about to do that. Why? Because that would engender the very crash that's a logical implication of these sorts of policies. So yes, he did talk about that, but he's jawboning. He's certainly not going to do anything in a substantive sense in order to upset that apple cart.
If you've just tuned in, this is ABC Digital on the World Wide Web. My name's Steve Austin. I'm speaking with Chris Leithner from the investment group Leithner and Associates. Coming up to 8 o'clock news in about 12 minutes from now, 8 o'clock on the East Coast and 6 o'clock on the West Coast of Australia. Well, this study that's been publicly released by the Bank of International Settlements, it's called The Future of Public Debt. It's a study that's been prepared by the Bank of International Settlements chief economist, and it says in it things like the aftermath of the financial crisis is poised to bring a simmering fiscal problem in industrial economies to the boiling point. This is Germany, France, England, Ireland, all of the big OECD nations. What are they warning about?
This report and a couple of others is basically saying that Western welfare states are broke. Let me carefully say what I mean by that. Western governments, such as the United States, the UK, European governments, have made promises to people. They've promised to pay them pensions, hospital coverage and so on, pharmaceutical benefits, which they basically cannot afford to keep. That's to say, the money required to pay these benefits in the decades to come is so great. There was actually a Fed economist in Washington who did the sums. Lawrence Kotlikoff is his name. In about 2006, he says, in America, one of three things has to happen. Personal rates of income tax have to treble. And he said that's politically impossible. That's not going to happen. Corporate rates of taxation have to double, but he says that's politically impossible. That's not going to happen. Or alternatively, things like Social Security payments, Medicare benefits and whatnot have to have. But he says, that's politically impossible. That's not going to happen. So the end of this very long and technical report was that, he shrugs his shoulder and says, there's a severe problem here. Politically, the problem ultimately is democracy, that politicians have made promises, voters have believed those promises, and the gap between the financial reality in the next several decades and the promises made, you can't square that circle.
So governments or treasurers around the world or Chancellor of the Exchequers around the world are writing cheques that can't be cashed.
That's precisely right.
But they are being cashed, Chris Leithner. They are being cashed.
As we speak, and they're being cashed with funny money. The British government, to give one example, its budget has galloped forward by about 25%. Industrial production is lower now than it was close to 20 years ago. Private sector employment is lower.
Industrial production
is lower in the UK as we speak at this very moment, and lower than it was in 1991.
Is it more efficient? Is it a higher quality production?
The short answer is no. Private sector employment, as we speak today, is at a level as it was in Mrs. Thatcher's day in the mid-1980s. The point I'm getting at is that these so-called cheques are written with funny money. People are beginning to realize so much debt has been issued, so much debt has to continue to be issued. Who's going to buy all of this stuff? Well, individual people, corporations, finance houses, and so on. The short answer is the risks are becoming so great that at some stage, and the BIS report, no one knows exactly when, but at some stage people say, this in actual fact is risky stuff. We want much higher rates of return for it. In other words, the interest rate payable on the sovereign debt has to be much greater than it is today. One wag
the bond market is looking for a financial means of covering a high risk.
The point will come, says the BIS, and it seems to me they're quite right, is that people in bond markets will suddenly say, goodness me, this stuff is much riskier than we thought. Because governments are producing so much of it, the quantity, the supply of this stuff is increasing so much. To increase the supply of something is to decrease its value. To decrease its value means we're going to take a loss on this. How to cover ourselves with the risk? Well, the interest payments it makes have to be much higher than they are at the moment. One wag says, look, traditionally, one regards Treasury securities in the United States as risk-free yields. In actual fact, they're becoming yield-free risks. That's to say, what we're being paid for this stuff is so minuscule relative to the actual risk that it really bears or will begin to bear in subsequent years that we just have to be properly paid for that risk.
Chris Leithner, the report or the study by the Bank of International Settlements also apparently says that official debt figures in the West are, quote, very misleading, unquote. Now, this was the accusation that was pointed at Greece, that when it joined the EU, its debt levels were actually 3 times higher than what they actually said it was.
That's right.
Leading to this current crisis. Is this study saying the same thing about other OECD nations, like Great Britain and others?
Oh, precisely right. And again, come back to the United States, which is the biggest, the 500-pound gorilla which lurks behind all of this. Greece, at the moment, is attracting attention because it's a relatively small country with severe problems, but there are much, much bigger countries with equally severe problems, such as the United States. Its on-balance sheet national debt is on the order of $14 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money. What doesn't appear in its financial statements are Social Security obligations to be paid for decades to come, Medicare, pharmaceuticals, the bank bailouts and whatnot, and that pushes the off-balance sheet total national debt closer to, estimates will vary. So, the bidding begins at $70 trillion, between $70 and $90 trillion. That's what he's getting at there in terms of that report, that what appears on official financial statements is only a small portion of the actual obligations that these governments have committed themselves, what politicians have committed the state to pay, pensions, medical benefits, and so on. And as those costs become much more apparent, the Obama so-called health care plan, which was passed, last week or a fortnight or so ago, each time a mammoth bill like that is passed, the proponents say, oh, yes, but this is going to help to decrease the debt. They've been saying that since the 1930s. At no time has it been true. At some stage, again, people have to wake up and say these sorts of things simply can't continue. The world is drowning in debt. And alas, when people drown in debt, they at some stage cease to breathe.
Is this report indicating a rarely often heard word, hyperinflation?
That's an extreme result. My guess is that, no, that's not going to occur. In other words, Zimbabwe is not our future, nor is the 1930s. What is our future? The 1970s, in which a lot of people in Australia would heave a sigh of relief. Actually, the losses that investors sustained in the 1970s were greater than the losses they sustained in the 1930s. Now, in terms of human suffering, the 1970s, we suffered through, we barely made it through Gough Whitlam, then came even worse Malcolm Fraser. So it was a tough decade. We mustn't underestimate that for a split second. But in terms of the misery compared to the 1930s, it wasn't the same. And in the 1930s, Australia wasn't nearly as badly off as countries like Canada, the UK, and so on. So the answer to the question is hyperinflation in our future? I've been wrong on all manner of things, and I haven't a crystal ball, but my guess is no.
Then this report, it does say current fiscal policy is unsustainable in every country in its study.
That's right.
Unsustainable, the drastic improvements in what they call the structural primary balance will be necessary to prevent debt ratios from exploding. They're using terms like, say Great Britain, debt levels to 300% of gross domestic product by 2040. It's hard to imagine that level of debt. It's hard to imagine how that actually affects an individual.
Well, to give an example, Alistair Darling was about a fortnight ago on BBC TV. He let slip, people call them gaffes, but occasionally politicians do tell the truth, and they tell the uncomfortable truth. The Labour government in the UK has promised not to touch things like spending on pensions, medical benefits, the National Health Service, etc., etc. And he let slip that given that certain things are simply off limits to cuts, he says what remains of the budget is going to have to be cut, quote, much more savagely than Mrs. Thatcher cut things in the early 1980s. Now, it's a misnomer. She didn't do much cutting. She decreased the rate of increase of government expenditure. In other words, that's a deceleration rather than an actual cut of the budget. She trimmed a bit of middle-class welfare, not much else. But the point I'm getting at is that the social memory that people like Margaret Thatcher cut things really isn't true. The point you've just made is that simply for the UK to get back to the pickle in which it found itself pre-2007 would entail cuts that have never occurred at any time in British history. So, again, we're back to that point that I raised about Kenneth Kotlikoff and the Fed to say, well, you can't cut this because that's politically impossible. You can't cut that. You can't cut the other. And yet, what we're looking at here, Well, I'll put it in private sector terms, that if the same sorts of obligations that exist in this country on company directors were applied to politicians, here's a fanciful thought, here's something that puts a warm glow in my heart, they'd all be basically imprisoned for trading whilst insolvent. That there's such a gulf between the rules which apply to each that perhaps one solution to our problem is that, well, whatever the rules are going to be, let's put politicians under the same sorts of rules that apply to the rest of us.
2 questions from listeners. My guest, by the way, is Chris Leithner from the investment group Leithner and Associates. It's 3 to 8 on the East Coast, 3 to 6 on the West Coast. Are interest rates here in Australia going up quickly so that the government or the Reserve Bank has room to drop them again if they really just sort of try and work the levers? In other words, if inflation is up and down, if we're actually entering a really quite a rocky period?
The short answer is I don't know. My guess is that that's a possibility. Low interest rates are poison. An interest rate is a price. It's a type of price. Prices emit signals. If governments intervene such that prices emit false signals, that confuses people and causes them to make mistakes. So that we have in this country a gargantuan coalition of inflation, which demands why, because their livelihood depends upon it, artificially low rates of interest, high property prices, high prices for stocks and bonds, and so on. The problem is not an increase of interest rates. The problem is the consequences of low interest rate. By lowering them, you cause people to make mistakes. When the consequences of those mistakes become clear, as they have, for example, in California, where property prices have fallen by 50%, and you see massive foreclosures and so on, what do governments do? Rather than step aside, let people clean up the mess and learn lessons from it, in effect, they say to the drunk, let's go on a pub crawl. What you need now, given that you're punch drunk, is another stiff drink or more methamphetamines or whatever the analogy is going to be. So that I wouldn't put it past the Reserve Bank to try, again, to artificially depress rates of interest, but that's going to make problems worse rather than better.
All right, a question you may not be able to answer, but Steve from Brisbane has sent a text message saying, can you confirm that the derivative bets handled by the Bank of International Settlements exceeds $565 trillion US? And do you know if that's true or not?
I know that derivatives out there, the sum total are in the trillions. Now, they net one another out. In other words, people are taking a bet. One person says, I bet that X will occur. The other says that X will not occur. And so that whatever the event is, then a lot of these things, these things are in the trillions of dollars. Banks have them, Australian banks, particularly to do with hedging of the currency and so on. I can't quote on $500 trillion, but certainly the sum total of all of these things out there is surely in the scores, if not the low hundreds of trillions.
I have to leave it there. Interesting times. Chris Leithner, thank you once again.
Thanks for having me.
Chris Leithner is from the investment group Leithner and Associates.